But welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to be discussing the importance of having a compensation strategy. I'm Rhoda McVeigh, and I'm the Director of Consulting Services for KMA Human Resources Consulting. KMA Human Resources Consulting works with successful, growing businesses throughout New England and beyond. We actually have clients in many states now. We're your partner for managing and growing your most valuable resource, your people. So just a little housekeeping before we get going. This webinar is designed as a conversation, but feel free to enter. This is a little bit about our mission, our value. But before we start, if you have any questions, we will enter them in the Q&A if you would, and that way we'll be able to take a look at them and we'll answer them at the end, leave some time at the end to be able to answer some questions as well. And so joining me today is Kari Meillat. Kari is KMA's compensation manager and an experienced expert in the field of compensation. Why don't we start, Kari, by you just telling a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure, thank you, Rhoda. So I started off my career doing analytics, working on the sales side of things, a little bit of sales compensation, and then progressed into a more traditional compensation management role at a couple of different organizations. From there, with managing the annual compensation programs and functions, to consulting. So I moved on to consulting on my own and found KMA, where it's been a really great experience to be able to help our clients figure out the compensation piece, how they should be paying people, what the market is saying they should pay people, and then talking through their compensation strategy and why they need one, which is why we have this webinar today, because it's a question that comes up all the time. People don't realize how important it is to have a compensation strategy.
Yes, it's definitely something Kari has a passion about. There's no question about it, and what we try and help our clients understand as well. So hopefully by the end of the seminar today, the webinar today, you'll have more information around it. So Kari, why don't we start by you helping the participants understand, what does it mean when you talk about total rewards?
So total rewards are all of the different things that you offer to your employees in exchange for their time and effort. These are tangible and intangible items that you offer, such as compensation, which is your base pay, maybe your incentive pay. It's also your benefits package that you offer. And more importantly, or just as important, it's the work-life balance of piece. So it's talking about well-being. It's talking about development, recognition. Recognition has been shown in studies to be just as important, if not more important, than your compensation and benefits. So making sure your employees feel committed and valued. So all of these different pieces are part of your total reward strategy and help you identify where you want to incentivize, reward, and motivate your staff.
Jenny, could you put up the graphic for us, please? That there it is. Thank you. Yeah. Speak to this for just a moment, if you would, Kari.
Absolutely. So your total rewards is really your employee value proposition. And in order to develop your total rewards, you should really start at the very top. What is your organizational mission and values that lead to your business strategy? And all of those pieces lead to your internal company culture, which in exchange relates to how you manage your employees, so your HR strategy, and then finally, your total reward strategy. So considering all of those factors should help you identify your total reward strategy. And then in the middle of this circle, it shows all the different components. So compensation, your base or variable pay, your benefits package, whether that's health, insurance, retirement, the recognition piece, again, how do you reward and recognize your employees for their commitment to your organization? Development is very important. Making sure your employees feel that they're developing their skills and they're increasing their career potential within your organization leads to longevity and appreciation really by employees, showing that the organization is focused on them growing and succeeding. And then the well-being piece. This is really what we used to call work-life balance, but it's kind of been rebranded recently to well-being. So focusing on your employees, not just in the office, but out of the office, making sure that what you value as a company is something that your employees value. And so there's a lot of different factors in the well-being piece, but that's a really important thing that I like to encourage right now is making sure that what you're offering makes sense and helps them succeed. The well-being piece is also something that's very commonly talked about right now with this return to the work versus hybrid versus remote work continuing. So we can talk a little bit more about that as we move on.
Yeah, it's all about the whole person, hiring the whole person these days for sure. And it does look complex when you look at it, but I'm sure you'll be able to break it down for us as we get more into it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how compensation and total rewards impacts being able to attract and retain talent in today's labor market?
So even though we are in a pandemic and some companies have really had to reconsider what they're able to offer, it's more important than ever to have a well thought out total rewards strategy and even compensation strategy, because you're looking to fill positions that are even harder to fill with people uncertain about making a move right now. With the economy, people may not be comfortable with leaving a secure job for another job that they may not feel is secure. So how do you translate to those prospective candidates that you have a well thought out strategy? How do you sell those benefits, those perks to your potential candidates? And also, how do you retain your employees? You retain your employees by listening to them. What are their expectations? What is the market saying? And making sure that the strategy that you've developed and all of the policies that you offer make sense for your employee population.
Oh gosh, yeah, it's really important for retention, not only just attracting, but you're talking about retention as well. So that's an important note for sure. So has compensation and total rewards concept become even more important as a result of the pandemic, the return to work, and that kind of thing? Is it something that employers are paying closer attention to now?
Absolutely, and I think it's a question I hear every week. Somebody's asking, well, we used to offer employees free coffee every day or lunches every Friday. How do we continue to offer these types of benefits to our employees when they're working remotely? So there's been a shift in a lot of these well-being programs and perks really that companies used to offer with their employees now scattered throughout the region instead of in a centralized office location. So it's more important than ever to think through what you used to offer and how you can modify or change or even add different benefits and perks to your employees that are remote.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that sounds like it would be difficult in terms of people's expectations that are remote versus, those that you hire in the office. So to that point, what's the strategy, the compensation strategy when hiring remote workers in different states? Are there different expectations on the part of remote workers?
Absolutely. And this is also a really important topic right now. A lot of companies have hired their first remote worker in a location outside their home state during the last few months. With a lot of the larger companies making the push to or providing the opportunity for their employees to continue to work remotely indefinitely, it's really opened up opportunities outside of our physical location. So if you're located in Portland, Maine, or if you're located in Nashua, New Hampshire, or even Boston, you can now apply for a job more easily in other locations that may or may not have a similar rate of pay. So some of the information I've been reading has said that for certain positions, such as the tech market, there may become a national market where the rate of pay for tech positions may not be based on your location. It may be a national average or even a national average plus a certain amount, because now companies are competing with Silicon Valley for that tech talent because they generally pay higher. So as companies in higher cost of living areas and larger companies define their policy going forward, that's going to impact everybody on what they have to offer in order to attract the talent that they need. So in terms of how you can pay those remote workers, A lot of it is going to come down to individual preference and how your organization is structured, whether you use your geographic differential, so base your compensation on the employee's home location, or whether you use the national average, or maybe you just use your home location, and as needed, if they live in a very high cost of living area, you can say predetermine a set increase that you would give based on certain locations. But it's very important to develop this policy, even if you don't have any remote workers. So you're ready. If you have a position you're recruiting for and you don't find anyone locally, and then you have to expand that search to a wider net, you already have that policy in place on how you would pay that person if you've gone through the process and determined how you want to pay people outside your location.
Are you seeing any one industry in particular that this is impacting? You talked about tech industry. Are you seeing it more in tech, or is it starting to kind of filter through other industries?
I think right now, because even though the remote work trend has been ongoing for probably the last decade, it's been primarily in tech-based companies. New startups, I think, have been more likely to have a fully remote workforce. But I think we're going to be watching the technology market and see how that compensation strategy shifts over the next several months to see how that's going to impact everybody else. I think for the most part, most organizations are going to look at a geographic differential continuing over the next 12 months. I don't think that the tech market where it's Silicon Valley minus 10% for everybody is going to apply, because that's just not really feasible for many organizations. So there's a lot to continue to watch and figure out.
Yeah. You know, and I know you often talk about keeping your pay policy or your philosophy simple. So how do you do that with all of these complex parts of it? How do you keep it simple? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think part of that is figuring out what your strategy is for remote workers, again, even if you don't have them. So going through the process and thinking through how your organization is structured, how you currently pay your employees in your home office, and then where do you see any current challenges? And then going forward, thinking about if you do hire that first remote employee in a different area, how would you pay them? So even if it hasn't happened, thinking through and creating that policy ahead of time will really help.
Okay. We have a question that's come in. How do you deal with a nationally high salary levels or nationally high salary when employees relocate on their own? Since I can be remote, I'll just go ahead and go to San Francisco instead of living in Topeka, where I am now. Should compensation be reduced if the reverse happens? They move from a very highly paid environment like San Francisco to a smaller one, and vice versa?
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion about this exact topic right now. And I think this is going to be based on your organization's ability to if an employee relocates to a higher cost of living area, it's up to an organization to figure out if they can offer that higher rate of pay for an employee deciding to move on their own. If you're requiring that an employee relocates, then that's one thing. But if they're opting to relocate to a different cost of living area, thinking through what value do they provide? Are they still providing the same value? Is the job still the same? And how does that impact comparable compensation within your organization? So always keeping in mind internal equity as well when making any of these decisions, and how people in a similar role are paid, even if they're in a different location. That's another factor.
But does the reverse follow as well? If I move from a highly paid area to low, should I expect to have money taken away from me?
In reading through some of the trends that are happening, especially like we pointed out with Silicon Valley, they are reducing the pay, but maybe not by as much as you would find if you were to start from the bottom and do a geographic differential and figure out, okay, what's the pay in Portland, Maine versus Silicon Valley? So it might be like a 30% difference, but if they relocate from a high cost of living area to a low cost of living area, maybe they're taking a 10% pay cut. So there's a lot of ways you can structure this, and it might be on a case-by-case basis to start with if you only have one or two people who end up relocating. But if you have a lot of people who are relocating, then it's even more important to think through and develop a strategy and to notify your employees in advance, be transparent and say, if you are relocating, this is what we're going to do.
Well, that's a good point. So, there's a lot of discussion around transparency in a company's pay practices. What is that about, and why is transparency important?
Right. So if your employees understand how their compensation is determined, if they know that you go through the process and you validate market data and you're very thoughtful about your approach, then they're less likely to think that they're not being paid fairly. So I know a lot of people ask, what do you do when your employees are talking about their compensation? Well, first of all, you should make sure that you're paying equitably internally, but then communicating to your employees that what we do, how you pay them is so important, and how you determine that level of pay. And that will help you develop your transparency around your compensation, and also communicate that to your employees so that they can focus on their job and not focus on the fact that they're paid less than a coworker, because they know the reasons why they may be paid differently if they have been talking.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, because as we know, we can't by law tell people they can't talk to each other about how much money they make. That's a labor violation for sure. So does pay transparency mean that everybody knows what everybody else makes in the company?
No, definitely not. So while they are allowed to talk to each other to figure out what they're paid, pay transparency more than anything just means that you're communicating to your staff about why there may be differences in pay. Are you paying high performers more every year on their annual merit because you're working to differentiate those performers? You want to encourage people to become better performers. So if they understand that, then that's really the goal of pay transparency, and having all of that built into your compensation strategy.
And you're talking about sharing that strategy and your philosophy with people so that they know if they're considered a top performer, they'll be potentially eligible to make more money as a result of that.
Absolutely. And this starts at the top in terms of developing that strategy, but it really is up to those managers to develop the right talking points in order to communicate that to their employees. You want to make sure that your employees feel comfortable talking about their compensation with their management, and having this transparency built into the policy and already starting those discussions with your employees will make it easier for them to talk to you if they have a concern. That way you can have a nice open discussion with them about how the policy is drafted, so they can understand, okay, well, I'm working toward my licensing. When I get my licensing, I can get an increase in compensation, or I'm paid this way because my performance is excellent.
Got it. And is those talking points, developing those talking points and helping leadership figure out how to have those conversations with employees, is that something that you can help the clients with?
Absolutely. And that really starts with developing that compensation strategy and thinking through how you're managing your compensation. So identifying when you give increases, when you do market assessments, when you do internal equity reviews, and developing your policy so that you can speak to that policy in those conversations with your employees.
Okay. Oh, well, that's good to know, because I think that is hard, is how do I have that kind of conversation? And if we can provide talking points, it can really be helpful, and, to have those things and expose it that way. You brought up equity a few minutes ago. There's a lot of discussion about equity. We all know DEI, right? DEI, and having a DEI philosophy, especially as a component of DEI. So what is equity all about?
Right. So I think a lot of people are aware of the laws that have been implemented about the fact that you cannot ask a potential candidate for their salary history. You can't say, what were you making before? You can ask for salary expectations, but I think it's more important to be upfront about the salary range and what you are offering, especially when you're thinking about negotiations. So a lot of people are not comfortable negotiating their salary when they're accepting a job offer. They'll just accept what they're given. And if they're not comfortable negotiating and you're just expecting them to accept the initial offer, well, maybe somebody else negotiates and they get 10% higher. Well, that creates pay inequity within your organization. And that's something that you should really focus on during the hiring process, and making sure that what you're offering people is fair and equitable. And being upfront about that salary range will save everybody time during the interview phase, because you're no longer perpetuating any inequality, because the range is different from what they were expecting, maybe because they were either more highly paid or paid less in a prior position. So you want to be upfront, communicate what your expectations are, and make sure your offers don't perpetuate any inequity.
So it sounds like you're saying, because what we have been talking about the last couple of years in the HR circles is, yes, don't ask, give me your salary history, but give me your expectations. It sounds like you're advocating, instead of asking for someone's expectations, just really being transparent with them. If you get to that point in the interview process with a candidate, here's the range within which you can expect to be paid. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, to some extent. So there have been some states that have currently implemented laws where they require companies to list the range in the job posting. I'm not necessarily saying you should do that, but I think when you're going through the process of hiring a new employee, you already have a budget in mind for the position. Right. And so taking that budget, creating a range based on your expectations for the skills and experience that you could hire into that position, having that in mind and communicating to an individual as you go through the interview phase. Well, we're going to offer $40,000 to $50,000 for this position. If you're okay with that, let's continue on with the process. If not, then you're going to save everybody some time by being upfront about what the offer is. At that point, they can ask if there's any wiggle room within that based on their expectations, and you can have the conversation then, but you already have that information in mind. So that's really what's important, is thinking through, what is the market rate of pay? What am I offering for this position? And making sure you start there instead of starting with asking them what their expectations are, which may not be aligned with the market.
Right. I mean, and really, unless you have like an in-house compensation person or you have access to salary data, how would you know what the market is other than what you see people self-posting on some of those websites, right?
Yeah, and that anecdotal information can be a great guide. You also want to consider during the process your internal equity piece. Again, that's very important. What are you currently paying your employees? It doesn't mean that you have to pay exactly what you're paying your internal employees, but if you do offer somebody significantly more money than where your current people are, just based on what's happening in the external market, you need to go back then and look at those employees that are paid lower and figure out if they need a market adjustment.
Okay. Got it. So how often do you recommend taking a look at, your own internal equity, your pay, where people are paid, the bands, that kind of thing?
So every year is really my recommendation for reviewing the market data to see if you're still paid appropriately. Not every company has the bandwidth or the money to purchase the data every year or to go through the process every year. So every 2 to 3 years is really the goal. And if you have a defined and developed compensation structure, it's important to review that structure every year to see if you have any employees that are paid below the structure or above the structure. Just as you've gone through and you've hired new employees, there's been turnover or there's been transfers internally. It's important to make sure you're doing that review, the internal equity review, every year. And then in addition to that, looking at some of the information externally that you can access for free. For example, looking at the minimum wage for your state or municipality and seeing if that has changed, and then adjusting your bands or salary grades according to that information, or even just looking at inflation and making sure you're doing some adjustment based on inflationary metrics.
It sounds like a lot of information and very technical to look at. Is that really realistic, or is that why there are people like you that do this for a living?
Yes, it is very important to make sure that you're looking at all of this stuff every year.
That's okay. Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry about what's going on in the background there. Don't worry about it. Just keep talking. You're doing great.
The joy of remote work, right?
That's right. Our coworkers, as we call them.
Yes. So, remind me, Rhoda, what was the topic?
Yeah. It was it was talking about oh gosh, I don't know. I just lost my train of thought too, actually. So I apologize in terms of. Oh, I said it's so much data. It's so much technical data to keep track of and be aware of. And is it realistic that a company is really going to be able to really look at all those components, or is that why there are people like you?
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the company and the internal skill set. So some people have the skill set already that can do the analysis, that can find the information and make the appropriate adjustments, where others need a little bit of help and others need the full scale compensation department to handle all of this stuff. So this is also why it's so important to have that compensation strategy identified for your organization. So you can have it written in there on how you're going to manage all these different components of data. How often are you going to update your salary grades and your salary bands? Are you going to do it every single year based on the rate of inflation? Or are you going to do it every 2 years based on the average expected merit increase, which is also a number that you can find. So if nationally people are expecting to increase merit by 3% and you haven't adjusted your salary grades in the last 3 years, then maybe you want to do more than just the inflation rate of pay, because eventually you will fall behind the market. And that is really tough on businesses if they fall behind the market, because then they have to spend even more time and effort figuring out what the market actually is, and then looking at their employees to figure out how far behind the market their employees might be. And then that could mean that they have to give 5-10% raises to employees to bring them up to the market, if that's their goal. So thinking through all of those different components and how you're going to manage them every 1 year, every 2 years, or every 3 years, having that identified so you know when you need to do a particular analysis.
Wow. It just sounds kind of complex. So if someone contacts you to say, help me create kind of our compensation strategy or philosophy, where do you start? How do you start with them? What's that conversation like?
Yeah, so that conversation will start with thinking about what's the mission and values, what's important to the company, and how do they want to enhance their corporate culture and manage their employees. So do you want to offer a higher wage, but maybe you don't have as many benefit offerings, or maybe your benefit offerings are a little bit lighter in terms of what the company contributes? Or maybe you want the other. Maybe you want to offer a competitive wage, but not the highest wage, but you have a really extensive benefits package. So thinking through from the top down, what's the mission and values? What's your corporate culture? And how do you want to encourage employees to stay with you? And how do you want to attract new employees? So that's the starting. And then from there, we go through, more in-depth conversations on each piece.
Okay, so I mean, this is information that they would already have, they would already know to start the conversation. So it gives you a starting point.
Absolutely, because the compensation strategy is going to be very customized per organization and what they want to focus on.
Got it. I know, probably a lot of people, oh, wait, we have a question. Let's see what this is. So do you suggest adjusting ranges every year that you do merit increases?
So in terms of the salary bands, as you do merit increases for your staff, say your salary band, just to throw some numbers out there, goes from $40,000 to $50,000, and you have employees within that band that are paid in all areas throughout that band. As you go through and you do a merit increase every year, eventually you will have employees that are paid over the band or over the midpoint of that band. And so that will create compression issues and could lead to an employee being redlined, meaning that they won't continue to get increases because they're over the salary band. So if you do not adjust your ranges at least every 2 to 3 years, you have a greater risk of compression than if you adjust them annually.
Compression, yes, another compensation term.
Right, and adjusting your ranges every year based on, for example, inflation. It's a great starting point, but it goes back to the fact that at least every 2 to 3 years, you should consider a market review to see where the actual market is, because you're adjusting by one factor. So some positions may have a pretty consistent rate of pay and they don't change drastically year over year. Other positions, you may run into a problem where you have a salary range, you're trying to hire for a new position, but everybody's coming back with really high requests for salary. And that's when you know that something is off, where there may be some positions, especially that you need to review more regularly than maybe every 2 or 3 years.
Okay, that sounds good. I know probably a lot of people participating, they have the same questions I do in terms of if I'm the HR manager, the HR director, how do I get my leadership, the C-suite people, to buy in on having a compensation strategy and the importance of it and all of that? What should I do to get their attention?
Yeah, well, employees for the majority of organizations are going to be the biggest expense that an organization has. And I like to actually reframe that from considering them as your biggest expense to your biggest investment, and thinking through and talking to the leadership staff about costs, investments, expenses, like how do you make your organization successful and succeed? It all comes down to your employees. Without your employees, you don't have people to do the work, to make the product, or to help the customers out, to pay the bills or do the marketing. So all of these different positions organizations need. And if you're not focused on, I wouldn't call it controlling the expense, I would call it managing the investment of your employees. So if you look at it that way and you think about the overall impact on the organization, I think it's a no-brainer that the leadership staff will be like, okay, this is a very important thing that we need to focus on because it's so much money, whether it's an investment or an expense, it's a lot. So understanding how you're going to manage that is very important. Even in a situation like we've all experienced over the last year, where there was economic uncertainty, we didn't know what was going on, employees weren't face-to-face, these major shifts that we've had, it's also important to think through and develop some policies based on managing expense in this type of environment. So how in personal finance, they recommend that you have an emergency savings account. So thinking through and having an emergency account for compensation. I know it's often hard to find extra money to sock away for certain things, for whether it's personal or whether it's corporate for an organization. Building that into your policy, your compensation strategy, will help you in a time when you have to quickly implement some of the emergency wage increases that people have had to deal with. So how do you deal with that? So it's important to think through all this stuff, have it written down, get the buy-in from leadership, work with them to develop these policies, and have that guide for you when things change.
Well, I like that term, managing the investment. I like that. That's a good one. So hopefully people are making notes on that. I have another question saying, any insight as to how far your minimum and maximum amounts should be from one another?
Another great question. And I think this depends a lot on your organization and the amount of positions that you have, the amount of salary grades, if you have a salary grade system, and also on the level of position. So best practice is generally to have a wider range for your top executive positions. People in those positions tend to have a wider range of backgrounds, maybe different expectations in terms of compensation. So you may need a 50 or 60% range spread for those positions in order to accommodate all of the different roles and responsibilities. For some of the entry-level positions, you may not need a spread anywhere near that. So a range spread is the distance from the minimum to the maximum for anybody who doesn't know. So for entry-level positions, for example, you might only need a 20 to 30% range spread. And that would be taking your midpoint, figuring out what's 20% more than that, what's 20% less than that, and see if that works based on your organization and how many people you have within that position, how many different types of positions as well.
Well, it's very formulaic, in other words, because I know we've always thought about min, mid, max, min, mid, max. But so you're saying that spread should vary based on the level.
Well, the mid, and max has to be developed from somewhere. So usually you take the market data, you figure out what the market midpoint is, if that's your strategy to pay people. And then from there, you have to actually determine the minimum and maximum of your range. So the market data will come back, and just based on the way market data is distributed, it may not be an even spread from that midpoint to the minimum and then from the midpoint to the maximum. So building in the formula for the range spread allows you to have a clean spread. So there's plenty of room, there's an equal amount of room to make it from the minimum to the midpoint as there is from the midpoint to the maximum. If you just use the straight market data without kind of modifying the range, then you may go from minimum to midpoint in 2 years, but midpoint to maximum might take you 6 or 7 years.
Got it. Okay, that's fascinating. So, there's also the school of thought, it's bantered around from time to time about total rewards statements. So that people understand the total value of your compensation. It's not just how much you get paid every other week, but it's the cost of benefits and the cost of this and the cost of that. Do you think those are helpful? Are those things that you recommend?
They can absolutely be helpful. I find that a lot of companies who don't offer these are often really excited to learn about them, because it's not just your base pay that you're offering to your employees as part of your employee value proposition, part of your total rewards, right? So identifying the benefits and the direct cost is the cost of those benefits per employee. So your health insurance premiums, what does your organization contribute to health insurance premiums? Or maybe there are other benefits such as free coffee. So you can outline that stuff in your total rewards statement to show your employees that they may only be receiving X amount in annual compensation, but all of their benefits, if you factor them all in, equal maybe twice as much as that overall. So it shows that the total value of them working for you is more than just their compensation. And identifying that line by line can be very helpful for some employees to understand that.
Mm-hmm. And is that something you would do annually based on changes in benefits each year? If you have to update your benefits plans based on merit increases or whatever it might be?
Yeah, absolutely. An annual review of that is very helpful and helps employees see year over year what that change is in their overall value from the company.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Good. And another question, that has come in is, if I'm only given like a 3% spend on merit increases, how do I differentiate paying my high performers a lot more and knowing that I want to give some people who are average performers something, but I don't want to insult them? So how, if I don't have very much of a wide pool, how do I go about thinking about how to utilize that to really incentivize the high performers versus the okay performers?
Yeah, and this is a really common question. And there's a couple of ways to look at it. You have to think about where your employees are currently paid. Maybe you focus on employees that are high performers, and then you focus on employees that are paid well below the market or their band based on continual good performance. So maybe they're not top performers, but they're average performers. So you want to focus on the high priority groups if you only have a limited budget. But also this leads to your pay transparency and communicating to your employees. So if you're not able to give a big increase to somebody, you can talk to them during their performance review and say you did really well this year. These are some areas that you can grow on. But due to the compensation budget, we're only able to offer, X amount increase this year. Mm-hmm. Another way to look at it is look at the actual dollar amount that employees get based on a percentage. So for example, your employees paid less money, getting a 3% increase might not generate a lot of extra compensation on their weekly or biweekly or monthly paycheck. So looking at it from a dollar perspective too, instead of a percentage perspective, might allow you to shift things around. So maybe you have a top performer, but they're already highly paid. So that percentage that they would have received would be just as meaningful if you did a flat dollar amount with a lower percentage. Sometimes it's the optics of it that you're focusing on and how you can equitably arrange those increases to make sense for employees, whether somebody at a lower amount's getting a slightly higher rate, but it might be just as meaningful to them in terms of what they see as a difference in their compensation.
Okay, so again, it's all about how it's the messaging and how, it starts with the philosophy, the transparency, and it's about the messaging when you're rewarding it as well.
The messaging is very important. And it's also important to know that it's not just compensation that you can recognize and reward people for on an annual basis. So focusing on these pieces throughout the year will allow you to handle some of those tougher discussions at the end of the year when you might be doing your merit process. So making sure throughout the year you're talking to your employees, you're thanking them for doing really well on a project, or you're encouraging your employees to look at their peers and call anybody out for going above and beyond and helping you out. You're also focusing on the development piece. So maybe you can't offer somebody a big raise, but you can offer them some money or time off to go do a class for something. So there's other ways that you can incentivize and reward your employees beyond just an annual merit increase.
Okay, the intangibles versus the tangibles, right? That kind
Absolutely.
of thing. I think sometimes people do forget about that. So thanks for pointing that out. And we have a really good question that's come in that I know we get often as well, that if we're hiring somebody who says, I don't need your health benefits, and so I want you to pay me more in my base comp because you're not having to pay that 70 or 80% of that premium. Is that something that you think should be considered or differentiated in terms of paying people more if they don't use our health benefits, paying them less if they do?
That is a really hard question because that comes down to internal equity. So if you did decide to increase the employee's compensation because they're not accepting certain benefits, where does that put them in the salary range? Where does that put them compared to their peers? But also if situations change and they want to take your benefits in a couple of years, what is the process then? Do you then claw back that amount that you gave them to start with? So that's a really difficult conversation and something that you should think through on all of those different factors on if that makes sense. Maybe instead of putting that into their base compensation, maybe you can offer them a different benefit instead, maybe more of a perk. Maybe you offer them some tuition reimbursement or something else that you're able to offer without throwing off the salary scales.
Oh, I like that. Get creative. Yeah, I like it. Absolutely. And we have another question here that says, how do you help an organization in outlining a compensation plan? Can you break down the steps, process, offerings in that?
So outlining a compensation plan. So first of all, if we're talking about salary scales or the market data, the first step would be to look at the positions, the job descriptions of that organization to figure out what the positions are to assess, and then go out to the market data, collect the data, analyze the data, and figure out where each position should be paid. From there, the next step would be to assess employee compensation to see if people are paid according to the market, and then advising them on where those challenges are, where people are paid vastly below the market, And then also looking at internal equity within that piece. So if people are in the same position, why are they paid differently? Can you explain the difference, or should there be an adjustment made to compensation? If we're talking about developing the compensation plan in terms of the strategy, then that's going back to that discussion of figuring out what you want to offer your employees, what your internal culture is, and how do you want to translate that culture to employee compensation and benefits.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, good, good. So, we've talked about the cost and the value of benefits and so forth. And I know you spent an amazing amount of time last year collecting benefits data for a survey. So can you tell us a little bit about that survey and if it's accessible to people on this call?
Yeah, absolutely. So we conducted a benefit survey last year to kind of get a pulse on what people are offering locally. So there's a lot of benefit data out there that has a more national focus, or maybe it's specific to an industry or particular benefit, whether it's maybe just a health insurance survey. So we wanted to see what other companies are offering, your neighborhood market compared to a large manufacturer. We wanted to see what everybody was offering. So we had some really good responses from that and some good data to share with people. So if it's something that people are interested in, then reach out to us and we can talk to you more about what specifically is in it and if you'd be interested in accessing it.
Okay, that sounds great. All right. Well, we've kind of reached the end of our questions. Any other questions coming in from the audience? This would be your chance, because we want to allow time for this at the end, because we've covered an awful lot of technical data today. That's for sure, Kari. So this has really been great, because compensation is one of those areas that I always left to the experts in the departments that I ran. I always made sure I had an expert working for me. Any other questions out there for Kari about compensation or compensation strategy in your company? Any closing comments then, Kari, you'd like to make?
Sure. So, I just wanted to point out how important it is for companies to have a well thought out total reward strategy. So not just compensation, but total rewards, because every single piece of this pie that we have on the screen is so important to consider how you're treating your employees, how you want to be treated as an employee, and how all of these relate to it. The well-being especially. Do you want to offer time off for your employees to volunteer within their community? Is that something that's important to your organization? It's also a way for you to think through really creative ways to encourage or to reward and recognize your employees, and then using that as a way to attract more talent. As we said earlier on in the podcast, it's really hard to fill certain jobs. Certain industries are having a really hard time filling positions. So thinking through all of these as a way to enhance that retention and talent attraction is so important.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's great. It looks like we've had another question come in. Do you have a recommendation for resources for employers to purchase, subscribe to develop their own compensation strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to that question on the screen. So resources for employers to purchase or subscribe to develop their own compensation strategy. So I think SHRM for a lot of our HR attendees, that's a really good area to go to for some additional information that you can find on your own. World at Work is really SHRM, but for compensation. So you can find a lot of information there as well to get going.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's because of the complexities, it really helps to have an expert like you weigh in on it, it sounds like to me.
Absolutely. And it's a discussion when you're developing your compensation strategy that is going to involve many parties. So it might start in HR or finance, even depending on your organizational structure. But it's also going to need buy-in from your organizational leadership. So your CEO, your CFO, your COO. And then always having an outside set of eyes or an expert set of eyes is beneficial in thinking through maybe some of the other areas that you haven't considered on your own if you're not engrossed in the detail.
Right, right. Well, you also talked about market data and survey data. That's not something that anyone can just access off the shelf. It's very expensive and you have to purchase it, right?
Yes, it can be incredibly expensive. There are lots of different large organizations out there that offer quality data that you can find on your own. And it can take a bit of time to understand it. So in terms of buying your own data, you really need someone organizing it who can look at it critically and analytically to determine how to actually use the data. Because generally what you get is a big export in Excel with all the different positions. So you have to go through the job matching process first to determine what the market position is. You have to determine if you're going to use one source or two sources or even more, combine them. So it takes a certain skill set and you may or may not have that on staff. And it can be a pretty big project, but I have worked with people who have their own system and they just need some guidance going through how to use the data.
And that's something that you can offer to people as well, as how to use the data.
Absolutely. I mean, I can help in anything. I have one client that I'm coaching through some of this stuff and explaining some of the best practices that we have in the comp world. Oh,
great. Fantastic. Any other questions from the audience? Because I think we're close to wrapping it up here. Doesn't look like it. I just want to thank everyone for participating today, for tuning in, and for giving us a chance to have you meet Kari Meillat, our compensation manager. And again, KMA, I know we've recorded this webinar, and I believe our marketing person, Jenny, will have it available on our website in the next day or so. But thank you for participating today. Let me see if this is a question. Oh, I have one more question that came in. One more. We're not letting you go yet, Kari. Do you have a suggestion about how to reduce staff burnout through compensation? If not having them your vacation, not having you pay. Oh, if not having them pay your vacation when they can't take it, use their vacation.
Yeah. So this is also a really an interesting area where you can be really creative in how you can support your employees during incredibly busy periods of work. Whether it's because there's been staff turnover and you're working to backfill, or there's been some layoffs, or it's just a really busy time, you can do things such as giving them a couple of extra hours off if they can't take a whole vacation day, Friday afternoon. Say, go ahead and take Friday afternoon off. Whether or not you deduct it from their vacation time, up to you. If you can afford to give them a couple extra hours off when they've been working really hard lately. You could, if they're remote, you could send them a gift card for a coffee or lunch, or you could have lunch delivered to their house if they're just unable to go out and take that lunch break that they would have had if they were in the office. If they are in the office, you can look at your policies. Do you have a dress code that maybe needs to be updated? Or can you be flexible with their start time in the morning? So maybe you're still asking them to work 10 hours in a given day, but they can come in a little bit later so they can sleep in and take their time in the morning. So there's lots of little work-life balance things that you can build in, or little perks that you can build in to encourage employees to keep going when they're in a real big period of burnout. And talking to them, making sure that you're listening to what their needs are. If they're coming to you and they're saying, I feel really burnt out, ask what you can offer to them, or what you can do, what they think the team would benefit from.
Yeah, that's very good. I know we've had questions also in HR circles about people who just haven't been taking their vacations because they've been working remotely and they feel like, well, I couldn't go anywhere the last year, so why would I have taken my vacations? So there's a lot of strategy around that these days, also in terms of encouraging your people to take their vacation, how to do that, etc. But that's a conversation for another day. So thank you everyone for today. Kari, thank you so much. So this was a lot of really great information, and I hope everyone has a terrific rest of the week. Take care, and we'll let you know the next time we have another webinar. Bye all.
Thank you. Bye.